On a chilly morning at the market, a little girl knelt on the cold ground, singing. No one stopped. Beside her, her mother sat quietly, clutching a thin coat, her eyes not searching, only waiting for something nameless. They once had a home, a father, a life. But everything was stolen, by a forged will and a death no one ever investigated. People called them crazy, manipulators. No one knew that the little girl was singing for a father who had died unjustly, until one man stopped. And instead of dropping coins into their empty wooden bowl, he asked, "Who did this to you?" And that was the moment justice began to wake up. Willow Bend, Ohio, a small village nestled amid endless stretches of cornfields, a place where everyone knows each other, yet no one truly knows what happens behind closed doors, where gossip travels faster than the wind, and strangers are met with lingering stares. On a crisp Tuesday morning in early fall, the air was dry, carrying the faint scent of apples and wild grass. In the marketplace, at the far end of the fruit stalls, a mother and her young daughter sat close together on the ground. Just the two of them, one grown, one small, sitting in silence. Clara, the mother, knelt with her legs folded beneath her, arms wrapped around herself. Her brown sweater was worn thin, and her faded cotton dress clung to her body, unwashed for days. Her hair hung loose and dry, and her eyes, the only part of her that didn't look down, stared straight ahead, unfocused. Beside her, little Emily knelt, holding an old microphone with a tangled cord leading to a small speaker at her feet. She sang, not loudly, not forcefully, just lifting an old melody. Perhaps it was Ave Maria. The wooden bowl in front of them remained empty. Passers-by, some paused for a second, then moved on. Some offered a pitying smile. Others avoided eye contact. A strawberry vendor whispered to her neighbor, "That nurse who married into the Dawson family. Look at her now." The other shrugged, thought she hit the jackpot when she married in. Turns out, it was the in-laws who changed the rules. The Dawson family was well known around here. Old money, landowners, lawyers, reputation makers. Gregory Dawson, the brother-in-law, was a lawyer, cold as steel, sharp as a blade. When he was alive, Andrew, Clara's husband, used to say, "Greg's so good at playing the law, he doesn't need to break it to ruin someone." Evelyn Dawson, Gregory's wife, was known as the Queen of Mill Creek, elegant, reserved, and utterly dismissive of anyone not born into her social class. Clara, a nurse from a community college, orphaned young, was never truly accepted. At the wedding, Evelyn had said outright, "She's not one of us. Let's see how long she lasts." Margot Dawson, the matriarch, not cruel but cold. She didn't scold or shout. She simply withdrew affection from Clara's life, like draining water from a vase, letting it wither without a touch. Then Andrew died. A car accident. No investigation. No one wanted an autopsy. Gregory handled the paperwork. Evelyn managed the funeral. Clara was forbidden from asking questions. 2 days after Andrew's death, Gregory tossed a stack of documents onto the oak dining table. Papers fanned out like black wings. "The will has been updated. Andrew transferred all assets to me for temporary management," citing concerns over his wife's mental health. He emphasized each word as if delivering a verdict. Signed, notarized. "You have nothing left, Clara." Clara looked at the documents, her gaze unwavering. Evelyn, standing nearby, let out a soft laugh. "Honestly, Clara, you being here was a mistake from the start. This family never needed a small-town nurse masquerading as a widow." Clara lifted her head, her voice gentle but firm. "What about Emily?" Gregory crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "She'll be provided for. Enough to live on. But only if you disappear. Stay silent. No lawsuits, no cries for justice." He leaned forward, whispering almost mockingly, "After all, Clara, the girl carries the Scott name, not yours. She doesn't need you to survive. In fact, she'd be better off without growing up under the delusions of a crazy mother." Evelyn stepped closer, her voice hissing through clenched teeth. "And if you insist on staying, by morning, the headlines will read, 'Mentally unstable widow manipulates husband, schemes to seize family fortune.' Believe me, the tabloids love prey like you. And the police, they enjoy revisiting unresolved cases, especially when prompted at the right moment." Clara hadn't yet spoken when Gregory gave the order. The housekeeper approached, avoiding Clara's eyes, and quietly ushered the mother and child out, as if taking out the trash. Despite Emily's youth, despite their shared blood. The door closed behind them with a chilling finality. Gregory returned to the table, raised his wine glass, as if sealing a clean business deal. In his eyes, only victory remained. No child, no mother, just power, and the last one standing. Emily clutched a one-eyed teddy bear. Clara carried an umbrella to shield them both, along with a cloth bag, a few changes of clothes, and a handwritten letter from Andrew, unbeknownst to anyone else. At the edge of town, they reached an old, desolate church. No lights, no people. But it had a roof. Clara wasn't seeking charity, just out of options. Pastor Thomas Green opened the door. The oil lamp cast light on his silver beard and eyes that needed no questions. "We just need a place for the night." Quietly, Clara said. "Come in," he replied. That night, in the cold church, Emily slept on a pew, her head resting on her mother's lap. Clara didn't sleep. The pastor left milk, bread, and a handwritten note. "God does not forsake anyone." Clara read the words. She didn't believe them, but she folded the note and tucked it into her pocket, as if holding on to something, anything. Outside, the rain intensified, echoing the sorrow of a woman steeped in humiliation. The next morning, Emily sat up, looked at her mother and whispered, "I want to sing, not to beg, just so. You know I'm still here." Clara nodded, and so they went to the market. No signs, no explanations, just the sound of a song. At the end of the market row, a stranger stood watching. Dark blue suit, polished leather shoes, hands in pockets, standing still. He was Lucian Whitmore, a man unknown to anyone here. But that day, he didn't walk away. And in his heart, something stirred. The next day, Lucian Whitmore sat motionless in his kitchen at dawn, hands clasped on the cold granite countertop. Outside the window, the fog had yet to lift, and the sun remained hidden behind the distant low hills. He hadn't made coffee. He hadn't turned on the news. He simply sat there, staring at the empty glass from the night before, still unwashed. That voice lingered in his mind. Clear, yet not loud. Delicate, yet not weak. It didn't resemble music. It felt more like a whispered confession, one that required the listener to hold their breath to truly understand. He remembered the girl's eyes. Not defiant, not pleading, just simply present. He reached for his wallet, checking if he still had a business card tucked inside. Then he stood up, put on his coat. He didn't drive. This time, he took out the bicycle that had been stored away for years, unused since his wife's passing. For the first time in many years, he had no specific destination, yet he rode on. The market was busier today than the day before. Vendors and shoppers jostled under the pale sunlight. The rustle of plastic bags, children's cries, and shouted prices filled the air. Lucienne stopped at the edge of the stalls, about 30 steps from yesterday's corner. The girl was still singing. Her mother sat behind her, shoulders slightly hunched forward. Nothing had changed, as if time for them was merely a patient loop. Lucienne reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. A $10 bill peeked out. He pulled it halfway, then paused. A breeze swept by, gently fluttering the bill in rhythm with his breath. Lucien looked at the money, then at the old wooden bowl, still empty, save for a few coins. He could step forward, drop the money in, nod, and walk away, simple, neat, just as he'd always done when he wanted to help the right way. But this time, he knew that wouldn't suffice. What they needed wasn't his money, at least not now. They needed someone who wouldn't look away. He folded his wallet, put it back, and stood still until the song ended. As Lucien turned to leave the market, a delivery boy, wearing a knit cap and carrying a crate of milk, bumped into him. "Sorry, sir." The boy stepped back. Lucien steadied him, gently. He noticed the crate was labeled St. Luke Church, donation. He paused. "You're delivering to St. Luke Church?" "Yes. Pastor Green asked me to bring it early for that mother and daughter." The boy nodded toward the market corner. Lucien gave a slight nod, asked no further. But that was all the information he needed. That afternoon, Lucien stood before the red brick church gate. No signboard, only a weathered wooden cross hanging from the roof. He knocked. After a moment, the door creaked open. An elderly man with a silver beard, wearing a dark sweater, stood blocking the entrance. "I'm looking for Pastor Green," Lucien said. "That's me," the pastor replied. Lucien took a business card from his coat pocket and handed it over. "Lucien Whitmore. I'm not a journalist, nor do I represent any organization. I just want to ask about the girl, the one singing this morning." Pastor Green looked at the card for a moment, then slipped it into his pocket. "They don't need anyone's pity." Lucien nodded, didn't argue. "I understand. I don't believe I'm here with the same mindset as those others." The pastor raised an eyebrow, not in annoyance, more like, "Ah, you're the honest type. I just know that I heard the girl sing, and when I got home, everything seemed meaningless." Green didn't respond immediately. He turned, gesturing for Lucien to enter the church, and the conversation continued from there. Lucien left the church just as the sun touched the hilltops. The entire village was bathed in a gentle grey dusk, and the information he'd gathered that day. The woman named Clara was once a nurse. The little girl with the clear voice, Emily, was only 8 years old, and a few crimes were being pinned on the fragile shoulders of those two. As he crossed the main street, he glanced toward the market, now nearly cleared. No one was there, but he knew, come morning, they'd return. And next time, he wouldn't stand at a distance. Every morning, in front of St. Luke's Church, there was always something new waiting to surprise Clara and her daughter. One day, it was a charcoal grey knit scarf, neatly folded and left on the cold stone step. Another morning, it was a small bag of warm scones wrapped in wax paper. Not too sweet, but fragrant enough to make your stomach quietly growl. Clara didn't say anything when she picked them up. She simply broke them in half and gave the bigger portion to Elena. The little girl never asked questions, but sometimes, while sipping the milk someone had left behind, she'd turn her face toward the door, as if expecting someone, then quietly turn back inside. In the old brick-walled church with stained glass windows filtering in soft light, Eleanor often sat on the third pew, flipping through a worn notebook filled with musical notations and humming softly to herself. The pencil was always half-sharpened. Her lyrics, scribbled in clumsy handwriting, were simple. I still sing. Because Mom is still listening, I still sing. Because we still have hope. No one had taught her to write like that, but her lyrics sounded real, like the voice of a child learning how to exist without waiting for someone to hold her hand. Clara sat a few pews behind, mending an old shirt with a borrowed needle and red thread from the pastor. Her eyes moved steadily with each stitch, not shaky, but no longer as sure as when she used to wear a nurse's blouse. Lately, whenever she looked at her daughter hunched over music notes, Clara felt thankful. She didn't know who to thank or why, but someone had placed a flicker of light back into their lives. Across the village, Lucian Whitmore still lived as usual, in a white brick house on a small hill, surrounded by elms and weathered stone paths. He had once been a man of crowds, but after his wife died 5 years ago, the mansion was left with only the sound of his footsteps, the kettle whistling and turning off by itself, and the creak of a window he'd never gotten around to fixing. No kids, no nearby relatives, no one calling to ask what he'd had for dinner. He'd grown used to the silence until he heard Elena's voice. It wasn't her singing that struck him. It was the silence surrounding it. The kind of silence that made people listen, even when no one told them to stop. Every morning, Lucien stopped by the market. He didn't buy anything. He didn't speak. He just stood a few steps behind, watching. He wasn't the emotional type, but something about that little girl made it impossible for him to turn away, even though he tried. That night, he went home and opened the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, the one where he kept old reports from when he'd been a senior shareholder at a major investment firm. He wasn't snooping, just haunted by the name Dawson ringing in his head like a quiet but persistent knock. And there it was. Andrew Dawson. Incident report. Q3 2018. Risk alert. Sent to Mr. Lucian Whitmore. No response recorded. He gripped the edge of the paper. He had seen this file before and ignored it. I was burying my wife at the time, he thought. I thought that was a good enough reason to stay silent. Now I'm not so sure. I didn't kill anyone, Lucian whispered, voice dry. But I stayed quiet and silence. Sometimes it's a way to let someone die. Maybe it was time to truly step in and help Clara and her daughter. The sky over the small village that day was still overcast, like a wound that hadn't yet healed. A steady drizzle soaked the tiled roof of St. Luke's Church, making the silence inside feel even deeper. Clara sat quietly in the second pew. In front of her was the old letter that Pastor Thomas Green had just handed over. It was a letter Andrew had written just days before he died. Something the pastor had kept hidden since the day Clara and Elena first sought refuge. "You weren't ready then," he said. "I didn't think someone already drowning in grief could bear another truth." Clara gave a small nod. She opened the letter with hands much steadier than they were the night they were first thrown out of their home. In the cold and quiet of the church, Clara's voice echoed, not trembling, not weak, just soft, like the whisper of a memory. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, it means what I feared has come to pass. The accident won't be an accident. I'm going up against Gregory, and I don't know if I'll win. I've sent warnings to a few people. One of them is a man named Lucian Whitmore. I've never met him, but I know Gregory once invited him to invest in a so-called religious land redevelopment project, which was really a front for money laundering. Lucian refused. Publicly. I believe, if anyone still has a heart, it's him." Lucien had arrived at St. Luke's Church just as the first light of dawn crept in. He hadn't called ahead, hadn't knocked. He simply stepped inside, drenched from the rain, his long coat soaked and shoes caked with mud. Pastor Green, wiping the altar, didn't ask why he was there. He simply nodded and motioned toward the back pews. Lucian sat in the last row. When he heard his name, he didn't look up. He only clasped his hands tighter over his knees. Clara folded the letter. Her eyes didn't tear up. They had learned too many times to hold back the tears to make room for action. "Gregory once asked you to invest," Clara asked, not because she saw him enter, but because something in her knew it was him sitting there. It was her first time addressing Lucien directly. He nodded. His voice was even, but heavy. 5 years ago, a project to restore an old church complex, combining cultural preservation with a meditation center. The proposal was clean, noble even. But I knew they were laundering money. And the land was right next to the cemetery where my wife is buried. I said no. Then I cut all contact. 3 months later, I received an internal report. Andrew Dawson, a senior finance officer, had sent a warning to the board about illegal activity. I read it, and then I stayed silent. Why? Lucien finally looked up. In his eyes wasn't guilt, but confrontation. Because my wife had just died. Because I was too tired to be the good guy. I thought I had played my part. Clara didn't glare or blame. Her gaze was careful, as if weighing something. You didn't kill my husband, but you knew. And now I ask you this. If there's any part of your heart left that Andrew believed in, will you help me bring everything into the light? Lucien stood, but this time he didn't just nod. Number, I won't just stand beside you. I'll act. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through old contacts. His eyes no longer held the fog they did that morning. He turned to Clara. I know a private investigator. He once worked a case for me involving internal fraud. I'll hire him tomorrow morning. We need solid evidence of the forged will and suspicious asset transfers. Pastor Thomas stepped forward, holding a newer, thicker envelope. He placed it on the wooden altar table. This is the real will. Andrew asked me to keep it safe, just weeks before he died. He was afraid the official documents would be altered. Clara opened it. Inside was Andrew's neat, concise handwriting. I, Andrew Dawson, leave all my assets to my wife Clara Dawson and our daughter, Elena. I also request the creation of a scholarship fund named the Emily Foundation for children who have lost loved ones. Her hands trembled as she read. The paper slipped from her fingers and fell to the ground. Lucien picked it up. He paused at the name of the foundation. Emily Foundation, he repeated, not just for charity, but so that another child doesn't have to sing in a market just to be seen. He turned back to Clara. I'll cover all legal costs. And if we have to face the media, I'll do it. You don't have to stand alone anymore. Little Elena still slept peacefully. In her arms, a worn-out stuffed bear was clutched tight. Pastor Thomas looked at the two adults, then spoke gently. Justice doesn't change the past, but it's the only way to heal the future. This time, Lucien didn't just nod. He pulled out his phone and typed a message. I need to see you. Urgent. It's about Dawson. Outside, the rain still fell, but this time, it felt like it was washing something away, making space for something new to begin. All three lifted their eyes to the crucifix above. The faint glow from the last candle reflected on the face of Christ. And in that silence, Pastor Thomas softly repeated a quote from Pope Francis. The poor are not a problem. They are the church's treasure. Lucien closed his eyes and nodded, as if reclaiming a lost part of himself. Clara held Eleanor's hand tighter. Even in her sleep, the little girl instinctively turned closer to her mother. And within each of them, a long-forgotten faith, broken and buried, was quietly beginning to breathe again. Where are you right now, as you read this? In a quiet room, on a late-night ride, or in the middle of a busy day? If something stirred in you, a memory, a line, a quiet sadness finally named, leave a thought below. Maybe your reflection will be the small light someone else needs while sitting in their own silence. Lucian left St. Luke's Church just as daylight fully broke. The rain had stopped, and sunlight was beginning to pierce through the trees surrounding the churchyard. It was right after he, Clara, and Pastor Thomas had finished their long overnight conversation. Just as the final candle in the sanctuary had flickered out, its warmth still lingering in their minds, like the echo of the Pope's words. He hadn't slept. He didn't need to. Last night was the first in many years that he felt no longer alone in the silence, and that was enough to keep him awake. He drove into town, his dusty black car rolling down the rain-soaked gravel road for the first time in ages. His first destination, find Martin Hale, a seasoned private investigator who had once worked a financial fraud case for Lucien's company 6 years prior. Martin now ran a modest office near the old industrial district, a place where people still came seeking truth outside the reach of the police. "Whitmore?" "Been a while," Martin said, raising an eyebrow as Lucian stepped inside. "I need you to find everything you can on Gregory Dawson. Wills, assets, recent transfers, and anything tied to Andrew's death." Martin paused a moment. "Is there risk?" "No risk greater than staying silent," Lucian replied, handing over a folder of documents and an envelope thick with cash. Meanwhile, back at the church, Clara was organizing her notebook. Pastor Thomas brought her a fresh stack of blank paper, a few ink pens, and a gentle suggestion. "You need to write it all down. Everything that happened. Every detail you remember about Andrew. We don't know what might be a clue." Clara nodded. She wasn't used to writing much, but this time, each word came steady and firm. She wasn't writing from anger. She wrote as a witness. No embellishment, no retreat. In another corner of the church, Eleanor continued her morning vocal practice. Her voice was fuller than usual today, no longer fragile, but clear, each note cutting through the air with intention. Ave Maria, gratia plena. The church doors swung open. Lucien had returned, his expression sharp, like someone staring down a contract where lives, not profits, were at stake. "I've started," he said, without preamble. "We have 3 tasks ahead. Reveal the real will, gather proof of the money laundering, and uncover the truth behind Andrew's death." Clara exhaled slowly. She knew the road ahead wasn't short, but at least she no longer walked it alone. That afternoon, Lucien and Martin arrived at the Fairhollow Land Records office. With Lucien's name and a reasonable consulting fee, they gained access to the Dawson family's property ownership files. In the newly digitized archives, they uncovered a suspicious transfer. 3 weeks after Andrew's death, 6 commercial properties had been transferred from Andrew to Gregory under emergency medical trust provisions. It was notarized, but the notary's name was Brandon Kessler, a man whose license had been revoked 2 years ago for falsifying documents. Martin smirked. "We've got a breach wide enough to shine a light through." Lucien nodded. "What about the forged will?" Martin picked up his phone. "I'll pull signature comparisons from the bank, where Andrew had a credit agreement. If the handwriting doesn't match, we'll have a legal foothold." Meanwhile, Clara made her way to meet Ben, a former colleague of Andrew's from the finance department. She met him at a small coffee shop north of town, about a 20-minute bus ride from Willow Bend. It was the first time she had left the village since that fateful rainy night. She left Elena with Pastor Thomas, who reassured her with a calm, "Go. God will look after her for you." The autumn wind stung a little, but Ben's eyes softened the moment he saw Clara. He pulled out a chair and asked gently, "How are you two holding up?" "I heard things, but no one knows anything for sure. How's Elena's school and your job?" Clara shook her head. "I quit. So did she. I don't need pity. I don't need trust from people who turned away. I need strength to save myself." Ben nodded, shame flickering across his face. After a pause, he took out his phone. "He told me he was being cornered, but I told him to stay out of trouble. I think I was wrong." Clara didn't blame him. She only asked, "Do you have any emails or documents Andrew sent you?" Ben nodded, this time without hesitation. "He emailed me 2 days before he died. There's an attachment. I never opened it. But now, I'll send it all to you." That same afternoon, in a sleek office in downtown Fair Hollow, Gregory Dawson was scanning financial headlines when he received an encrypted message from his personal assistant. "Lucien Whitmore is digging." He visited the land records office with a P.I. Gregory looked up, leaned back in his mahogany chair, and tapped his fingers on the desk. Immediately, he dialed a number: Thompson, his legal advisor and right-hand man in every shady operation. "Call Brandon Kessler. Clean up whatever needs cleaning. And remind the mayor he owes me a budget vote from last year." At Fair Hollow City Hall, Mayor Carl Whitaker, a politician once quietly funded by the Dawson family, stepped into his private office and shut the door. He frowned as Gregory's voice poured through the phone, his fingers tightening around a fountain pen. "That issue was buried, Gregory. What more do you want? Make sure Whitmore doesn't bring in reporters or state auditors. If you still want another term, remember who kept quiet about that school construction fund." Carl hung up, sweat gathering on his brow. He knew, if the past surfaced, his office wouldn't be big enough to hide what lay beneath. That evening, back at the church, the group gathered again. Clara had printed the email. Lucien brought the latest documents. Pastor Thomas lit the candles, like the start of a courtroom session in the sanctuary's quiet embrace. Lucien spoke with conviction. "We won't hide. We won't run. Starting tomorrow, I'll have our attorney request a full review of the asset transfers. And if we need to speak to the press, I will." Clara smiled. Not a relieved smile, but one from someone who sees the storm coming and is ready to stand in it. Elena sat between the two adults, watching the flickering candlelight. She said softly, "I think Daddy would be happy, because someone believed my song was real." Pastor Thomas gently squeezed her shoulder. "Not just real, but strong enough to wake up those who've been asleep in silence." Later that night, Lucien quietly opened his laptop. He typed a short statement to the local newspaper, one he had once funded a literary scholarship for years ago. "I, Lucien Whitmore, am no longer a bystander. Years ago, I stayed silent in the face of a cry for help. That silence cost a man his life. I will not let it cost another child their future." Clara sat quietly, saying nothing. When Lucien hit send, she stood and walked out to the church hallway. In her hands was a handwritten letter, her own shaky but clear script. A letter to Andrew. "I don't know if you can hear this, but if you're somewhere out there, I just want you to know I didn't fall. I no longer want justice for myself. I want it for our daughter. And for those who still believe a kind world isn't just a fantasy." She placed the letter at the foot of the altar, beneath the crucifix, and took a step back. Elena came to her side, holding her hand. Pastor Thomas, watching from behind, spoke softly. "Pope Francis once said, 'The poor are not the problem. They are the church's treasure.' Today, we are living that truth." Lucien looked at mother and daughter, not with the eyes of an investor, but with the gaze of a man who, for the first time, felt he was in the right place, at the right moment. The next morning, the air in Willow Bend felt heavier than usual. It wasn't raining, but the wind was fierce. The sky hung low and dark, like an old blanket that hadn't been shaken clean. Lucien woke from the leather chair in his study. The local newspaper lay open beside him, His statement now front-page news, printed in bold type, beside a blurred photo of St. Luke's Church. A leader's wake-up call from the shadows. Silence killed a man. The article had spread across Fairhollow in less than 12 hours. Some supported it, others doubted. But one thing was certain, no one could ignore it anymore. In the mayor's office, Carl Whitaker slammed the paper down and paced furiously. That lunatic is unraveling everything. Gregory, if you can't get this under control, You'll what? Gregory cut in over the phone. I'm the one who kept your construction fund scandal buried last year. Don't forget. Do your part, and let me handle the rest. He hung up and turned to Thompson. Time to strike back. Call in our media contacts. Leak a story. Lucian Whitmore is manipulating a mentally unstable widow to seize property. Attach the temporary will I've got. Back at the church, Clara received an email alert. Her and Emily's names had surfaced in slanderous posts on social media. Someone had snapped a photo of her sitting outside the market, paired with a cruel caption. Distraught mother using child to beg, now aiming to marry into millions. Clara froze for only a moment. She didn't collapse. She simply turned to Pastor Thomas and asked, Do good people always have to be misunderstood before they're believed? Thomas answered softly, Christ wasn't crucified because he was weak, but because he refused to turn from the truth. Lucien read the articles, his jaw tightening. He stood and called his lawyer. Prepare a defamation suit. And call another paper. I'm going to show them what truth sounds like in the right voice. That afternoon, Clara took Emily for a walk around the village. The little girl clutched her mother's hand. They're lying, Mum. Why aren't we angry? Clara smiled, brushing her hand gently over her daughter's hair. Because even if we get angry, they'll still talk. But if we stay quiet and keep singing, they'll have no choice but to listen. That evening, the church glowed with candlelight. Clara stepped forward. For the first time, she publicly read Andrew's real will, the original document preserved by Pastor Thomas, signed and officially notarized. Lucien stood beside her. Emily sat in the front row, her eyes shining bright, and for the first time, the entire village of Willow Bend applauded. Gregory watched the live stream, the wine glass in his hand shattered against the floor. When the reading concluded, Clara descended the church steps. Lucien walked silently beside her. He didn't speak much, only offered a steadying hand at the final step. A simple gesture, but enough to make Clara pause for half a beat. Thank you for not turning away, she said, eyes gazing out toward the distant lights. Lucien gave a quiet smile. I'm not sure I have the strength to keep running anymore. Sometimes staying is the only way to truly live. Clara didn't reply, but as the wind swept through her coat, she pulled it tighter, not from the cold, but as if trying to hold on to something small and new that had begun to grow amid the ruins. That night, as Clara prepared to close the church doors, she noticed a folded note slipped through the gap. She picked it up, red marker scrawled across it in shaky, menacing letters. You should know your place. For Emily's sake. Losing another man would hurt, wouldn't it? Clara didn't scream, but her hands trembled. She immediately called Pastor Thomas. Within minutes, Lucien was there. Pastor Thomas read the note and clenched it in his hand. They're trying to scare you, because they know you're close to unearthing what's been buried. Lucien called Detective Martin on the spot and arranged for overnight security at the church. He also informed the Fairhollow police. Despite having little faith in the local authorities, the legal protocol had to be in place. We won't back down, Lucien said as he stood at the church entrance, the dim light casting shadows across his shoulders. If they think they can silence Clara, they've forgotten one thing. She's not alone anymore. Clara looked at him, her eyes red but steady, filled with a resolve that wouldn't be shaken. She gripped Emily's hand and said, "We're not hiding anymore. Tomorrow, we bring everything into the light." Just after the will reading, an unusual email landed in Lucien's inbox. The message read, "I have something Andrew left behind. But we must meet in person. Trust no one else." Sender, Caleb Morton, a former employee in the finance division at Dawson Holdings, who had vanished after Andrew's death. Lucien and Clara decided to go to Fairhollow the next morning. They met Caleb at an abandoned garage behind the old bus depot, a place no one had visited since the train tracks were dismantled. Caleb's hands trembled as he handed over an old cassette recorder. "I've had this since that year. Andrew sent it to me, told me to only open it if he disappeared. I was afraid. I stayed silent. But now, I can't live with it anymore." Lucien pressed play. Andrew's voice emerged, clear, calm, and unwavering. "If you're hearing this, I didn't make it. Gregory and Evelyn, they forged signatures, manipulated assets. And Margot knows. Mom knows everything. But she chose power over truth." Andrew's voice cracked slightly. "I'm scared for Clara. More than anything, I'm scared Emily will grow up thinking her mother's a thief." Clara tightened her grip on Lucien's hand, her eyes brimming with tears. Caleb bowed his head. "I'll testify, and I have a copy of an internal email. Gregory used the company's legal name to legitimize illegal asset transfers." Lucien nodded. "We'll protect you, both of you." That night, Clara and Emily returned to the church. Clara held her daughter close and whispered, "Tomorrow will be hard, but it's the day you'll finally be able to call yourself the daughter of an innocent man." Emily looked up at her. "I never doubted that, Mom. I just want the world to believe it too." On Monday morning, thick fog blanketed the road into Fairhollow. Clara, Lucien, and Emily sat together in the car. No one spoke. Clara held her daughter's hand the entire way, while Lucien kept his eyes fixed on the passing landscape through the window, silent, holding back something within that couldn't quite be named. Outside the courthouse gates in Fairhollow, a crowd had gathered. Many familiar faces, people who had once dropped coins into Emily's wooden bowl, people who had turned their backs, people who had whispered behind hands, now stood in quiet witness. Not to judge, but because they could no longer pretend not to see. Emily clung to the hem of her mother's coat. Lucien leaned down and adjusted the collar of her jacket. Clara looked at him and nodded. Not a thank you, but a message. "We trust you." They entered the courtroom without pause, without looking back. Across the aisle, Gregory sat in the front row with Evelyn. His expression was confident, not smug, but calculated, the look of a man who believed he had buried every trace of the truth. He crossed his legs, offering Clara a faint smirk, as if the trial was just a brief performance he'd soon exit with another quiet victory. Evelyn remained razor-sharp, her eyes scanning the courtroom with cold detachment. She lightly scraped her leather gloves with manicured nails, not in nervousness, but as if she were timing the next move. For them, this wasn't the end. It was just another opportunity to reassert who held power in the shadows. What they didn't know was that truth no longer belonged to them. Seated quietly in the back was Mayor Carl Whitaker, not part of any official delegation, not invited. He lowered his head every time a camera panned toward him, but he didn't leave. Perhaps he already knew. Today, even if not a defendant, justice had crept right to the hem of his jacket. Caleb Morton took the witness stand. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was clear. "I was an employee in the finance department at Dawson Holdings. Before his death, Andrew Dawson sent me a package containing documents and an audio recording, in case something happened to him. I kept them hidden for years out of fear, but today I submit them as evidence. The plaintiff's attorney activated the recorder. The courtroom fell silent as Andrew's voice rang out. "Gregory and Evelyn, they forged my signature. My mother knows, but she stayed silent. If I disappear, Clara will be left with nothing, and no one will believe Emily." A muffled sob in the recording caused several people to lower their heads. Clara bit her lip, eyes shut tightly for a moment. Next came Pastor Thomas Green. He wore a black cassock and carried the original will, independently notarized and signed by Andrew himself. "I confirm that Andrew Dawson personally handed me this will, asking me to safeguard it until the truth could be brought to light. This document leaves his entire estate to his wife, Clara, and establishes a scholarship fund for orphaned children." A stir rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney tried to interrupt, but the judge held up a hand. "You may not interrupt the witness. Continue." Then came the turning point, the climax, when Clara's attorney presented documentation of a suspicious property transfer bearing the signature of notary Brandon Kessler, whose license had been revoked for fraud. A court-certified statement confirmed that Gregory had paid Kessler in cash just 3 days before Andrew's fatal incident. The judge leaned back and let out a slow sigh. "We'll recess to allow the panel time to review all submitted evidence and hear further witness testimony." Gregory sat frozen. The confidence that once anchored his expression was now clouded with panic. He turned toward Evelyn, whose knuckles had gone white from gripping the armrest, and muttered something between clenched teeth. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them spoke of victory. Those who once believed themselves above the truth were now sinking into it. Outside the courthouse, the people of Willow Bend applauded as Clara and Emily stepped out. There was no noise, no spectacle, just quiet respect, like a long overdue apology from a community that had once turned away. Lucien walked beside Clara. When she stopped, he said softly, "You did what no one else dared to. Not for vindication, but because you loved the truth enough to suffer for it." Clara looked at him. For the first time, her gaze held no caution. Only trust, pure and full, as if something new had finally begun. 3 days later, the Fair Hollow District Court resumed its trial. This time, the courtroom was more crowded than ever. The skeptical glances were gone, replaced by quiet, focused eyes filled with empathy and the shared anticipation of justice. Clara entered with her head held high. Emily walked beside her, still holding her hand. Behind them, Lucien and Pastor Thomas followed, their expressions calm, yet unwavering. At the defendant's bench, Gregory no longer crossed his legs. Evelyn no longer scratched her gloves. The two of them sat stiff-backed, as if they had just braved a storm and knew they no longer had an umbrella. The judge held a thick folder and spoke firmly. "The court has reviewed all submitted evidence, cross-examined witnesses, and examined the relevant legal documents. Based on the findings, we rule that the valid and final will is the one signed by Andrew Dawson and safeguarded by Pastor Thomas Green. The estate is to be returned to the rightful beneficiaries, Mrs. Clara Dawson and her daughter, Emily Dawson." A quiet breath swept through the courtroom like a soft wind, but it wasn't over yet. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "regarding the death of Mr. Andrew Dawson, the court has received additional evidence from the plaintiff. This includes a mechanical forensics report collected by investigator Martin Hale, confirming that the brake system of Mr. Dawson's vehicle had been tampered with." A murmur rose among the spectators. Gregory's eyes darted, sweat glistening on his forehead. Also presented was testimony from Mr. Caleb Morton, who submitted internal emails revealing that Mr. Gregory Dawson hired a third party to alter trip data and conceal accident evidence in the insurance report. These actions will be subject to separate criminal investigation and may result in additional charges. The defendant, Gregory Dawson, is hereby charged with falsification of legal documents, bribery of a notary public, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud. In addition, based on new evidence and witness statements, the court finds that Gregory Dawson, in collaboration with Evelyn Dawson, orchestrated the car crash that resulted in the death of Mr. Andrew Dawson. This was a deliberate act driven by intent to seize assets and silence opposition. These criminal charges for premeditated homicide will be transferred to a higher court for further prosecution. Defendant Evelyn Dawson is charged as an accomplice for witness tampering, aiding in the destruction of evidence, and colluding in fraud. The court orders both defendants to be taken into custody immediately pending further investigation. Gregory shot to his feet. "You've got nothing but slander and a tape recording." But before he could finish, the back door of the courtroom opened. An elderly woman, thin, silver-haired, leaning on a cane, entered. All eyes turned to her. "Mother?" Gregory froze. "Margot Dawson." She didn't look at him. Instead, she walked to the center of the room and asked permission to speak. The judge nodded. I once knew the things Andrew said in despair. He came to me, his eyes red, his hands clutching a letter he never got to send. He begged me, if anything happened to him, to protect Clara and Emily. But I didn't. I thought he was exaggerating. I believed Gregory instead, because I couldn't accept the truth about my own son. Her voice lowered. I was afraid of losing Gregory, afraid the lies exposed would ruin the Dawson name. But I lost my son the moment I chose silence. Silence for reputation, for status, for fear, and in doing so, I let a good man die alone. Now I have nothing left to protect. Only this apology, not to save myself, but to gather the pieces of all I've let unravel from my one wrong decision. She turned to Clara. I'm sorry, I have no right to ask, but I beg your forgiveness. Not because I deserve it, but because Emily deserves to know not every adult turns their back on what's right. Then she looked down at the girl. I don't know what to say to you, Emily. I am your grandmother, but I failed to be one. I was there when you were born. I heard you laugh. I watched you take your first steps. And then, I stayed silent when you lost your father. I chose silence when I should have stood for you and your mother. Her voice cracked. I don't deserve your recognition. But if you can, please keep living, keep singing, like you always have, to remind people like me that courage doesn't always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from a small, unyielding heart. Clara didn't speak, but tears fell. Not from pain, but from the closure of wounds, too long unnamed. Emily remained silent, too, a chilling silence from a child only 8 years old, yet already burdened by the sorrow that came with the word family. Margot bowed and walked out, and Gregory was stunned into stillness. Evelyn exhaled, as if releasing whatever will to resist she had left. That afternoon, on the lawn of St. Luke's Church, Emily performed a new song during a small charity concert, part of the Emily Foundation, newly announced by Lucian. Her voice rose into the golden light of sunset. Lucian and Clara sat side by side. On stage, Emily sang with a brightness in her eyes that defied everything she had endured. Clara turned slightly toward Lucien. I'm not used to peace, but maybe I'm ready to learn. Lucien smiled. Me too, and if you'll let me, I'd like to stay and learn it with you. Clara looked at him, her gaze no longer guarded, only soft and quietly grateful. They didn't say more, but their hands found each other and held on. A slow, silent agreement. but firm. Clara's face glowed brighter than it had in years. Her hair fell naturally around her shoulders, no longer tangled. For the first time, there was something in her eyes that resembled hope. Emily turned to glance at her mother and Lucian from the stage, smiling with the joy of a June morning. Above them, the sky over Willow Bend had cleared. The thick grey had lifted. Wisps of cloud floated aside, revealing a blue so pure it felt almost unreal. Sunlight bathed the church roof, refracting through stained glass into ribbons of light, like a final miracle, arriving just in time. Everyone in Willow Bend rose in applause. No one spoke of the trial. No one mentioned scandal. There was only music, light, and a kind of faith reborn from things once thought lost. When the song ended, Emily bowed deeply. "I sing for my mum, for my dad, for Mr. Lucien, and for anyone who still believes justice doesn't sleep. If you've ever witnessed injustice, don't stay silent." Because, as Emily sang, justice only sleeps when good people stop speaking. Be someone who stands beside the truth, even if it's just with a word, a look, or a well-timed hand to hold. That may be enough to change a life. And if you are Clara, believe this: one day, the sky will stand with you, too. 1 year later, Willow Bend seemed unchanged. The birch trees still rustled gently along the dirt road, the weekend market carried on as always, and St. Luke's Church still rang the first bell of the morning. But, for Clara, everything was different. That morning, she didn't wake to the weight of fear, but to the soft scent of fresh-baked pastries from the kitchen. Emily, now 9, sat at the table, legs swinging in the air, humming a new melody as she worked on her music homework. Lucien stepped in from the porch, holding a small bouquet of lavender freshly cut from the backyard. His eyes met Clara's. No words were needed. It was enough for both to remember just how far they'd come since that first meeting at the marketplace. He set the bouquet down gently, then spoke in a quiet voice. "I used to think I'd spend the rest of my life alone, Clara. But since you and Emily came into it, everything changed. Not because I needed someone, but because I finally had a reason." Clara turned toward him, calm but serious. Lucien stepped closer. "I'm not asking to replace anyone. I'm only asking to stand beside you, like this, and if you'll let me, for all the days to come." She didn't answer right away, but her eyes softened, like a fogged window finally cleared. Then she nodded, not loudly, not with fanfare, but with just enough certainty for a heart once closed to begin opening again. "Coffee?" he asked, voice light. "If you make it," she smiled. They didn't need to speak of the past. It was still there, in every glance, every silence, but no longer heavy. Emily turned on a small speaker, and her voice filled the kitchen like morning light pouring through the windows. Just last month, a special envelope arrived at St. Luke's. Its seal bore the crest of the National Conservatory of Music. Pastor Thomas was the first to open it. His voice, when he called Clara and Emily to the church, trembled with a joy they'd never seen in him. "Emily, you've been awarded a full scholarship. They heard your recording from a market performance, and they want you in the next term." Emily's eyes went wide. Clara clutched her daughter's hand, unable to hold back tears. Pastor Thomas looked at them, his eyes filled with pride. "You don't just sing with your voice, child. You sing with a soul the world forgot it needed. God didn't just listen. He called you by name." That afternoon, the three of them went to the market. No more wooden bowl. No more pity-filled stares. Emily no longer sang to survive. She sang to share. She stood on a small platform next to the flower stall, her old microphone replaced by a star-shaped mini keyboard. That evening, Clara sat down to write. A letter to Andrew. Today, I watched our daughter sing in the same market where we once hit rock bottom. I don't carry bitterness anymore. I keep the memories, not to drown in them, but to teach our daughter that forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing not to let pain lead us forever. Lucien is with us, not as your replacement, but as someone who hears the quiet spaces in me without trying to fill them. I think, if you were here, you'd be friends. Thank you for leaving me, Emily. She's the most beautiful melody life ever wrote for me. Clara folded the letter and placed it beside an old photo frame. Outside the window, the church bells rang, echoing across the small village. Another day had ended, not with tragedy or suspense, but as a simple, ordinary day, the kind of day they once thought they'd never have again. And for Clara, Emily, and Lucien, that was enough. The following spring, Willow Bend shifted quietly, like a gentle breeze passing through. The birch trees sprouted fresh leaves, and the lavender bushes in front of St. Luke's Church bloomed a soft purple. No one made an announcement. No bells rang louder than usual. But the whole village knew a new chapter had begun. After the adoption hearing, Lucien officially became Emily's legal father. The court approved the decision based on records of his care, financial support, and the unmistakable bond they shared. Clara signed the papers alongside him. No one used the word replacement, only complete. Pastor Thomas, the village's eldest and the quiet soul of St. Luke's, officiated their wedding on a quiet Sunday morning. There was no tent, no gown, just two people holding each other close, a nod, and the pastor's words, "God has done his part. The rest is yours now." Emily held her mother's hand, and with the other, Lucien's. Her eyes sparkled. As the pastor offered his blessing, Emily looked up and asked, "Pastor, has the Pope ever come here?" He chuckled, not out of surprise, but from something tender. "He has, sweetheart, because every time you sing, I'm sure he hears you." The crowd laughed, then applauded. Some who had once whispered doubts now brought cakes, flowers, and tentative hugs. Blessings replaced gossip. Apologies became smiles. After the ceremony, Lucien announced plans to fund a full restoration of the church, preserving its spirit, but expanding it with free community classes in music, literacy, and woodworking. Clara would teach basic first aid. Emily would perform on the first Saturday of every month, not to raise funds, but to connect hearts. The local paper published a photo of the three of them. 3 smiles, 3 stories, but one shared heart. The headline read, "From what once was broken, they built a home for an entire village." On the last night before Emily left for school, the 3 of them stood at the kitchen window. Warm yellow light spilled through the glass and glowed across an old photo of Andrew. Lucien wrapped his arms around Clara and Emily. "Tomorrow, we begin a new chapter. But tonight, let's sing one more song." Clara nodded. Emily smiled, and their voices rose, soft, clear, steady, carrying through the garden, past the church, and onto the rooftops, where someone, somewhere, might still need a reason to believe. A new world doesn't begin with revolution, but with love strong enough to hold someone in place. And in Willow Bend, that world had just opened. Up in the church's bell tower, the wind nudged the chimes, as if whispering to those who had walked through a long winter of their lives. Healing is real. It doesn't arrive loudly. It makes no promises. It simply stays, in a gaze, a song, a quiet faith. Clara, Emily, and Lucien's story, as Pastor Thomas once said, wasn't a miracle. It was proof that even the most ordinary things can become extraordinary if someone chooses to stay. And if you, the one who quietly stayed with this story until now, have ever been the unheard one, the person walking through life with an empty bowl, or the one sitting before a locked door. Please believe this. There are still places in the world where even the smallest song can move the sky. Thank you for listening to this story. May you leave with a warmer heart and a quiet faith that the most beautiful things don't always arrive in grand gestures, but sometimes in a melody, a held hand, or someone who believed in you just long enough to walk with you into the light.